want to quickly, I think, just bring up three of my Howard colleagues to please kind of broaden the debate and give their perspectives on the broader topic. It's not necessarily a response to the specific papers, but general reflections on the broader subject. So let's begin with Professor Lorenzo Morris, please. Sorry.
If you can.
Well, I'll just start with my general worldview of social science, on which I've reflected substantially since I came here to this program again. And I say that almost sincerely because I think generally since we began with the story is that my general worldview says that in the complex of events that we look at in places like Howard and social history, the job, it seems to me, of historians is to unearth the facts and to clarify their position in place, whereas the job of political scientists is sort of to put the facts back in their place and bring things together in a sort of whole. And in that whole, sometimes we tend more than others to obscure the facts. And so I had not thought, and to be in all honesty, that I would label anything the Howard School of International Affairs. Simply because it's so hard for me to separate these inquiries and the activism that accompanies them from looking at racial inequality as a primary function of many of the people, the work of many of the people, with the exception of obvious cases like Morris Tate, who came here. Because when Bunch was a professor here, he was basically doing what we would call black politics today. But then it occurs to me that, as with his dissertation, that so much of what really links these things from my perspective is the concern for equity and maybe fairness and maybe justice in the world that goes from colonialism and back into one of the comments today about, or Pearl Robinson's comments about the 1947 conference reminds me of the meetings that Ralph Bunche, E. Franklin Frazier, and Abram Harris, an economist and a sort of known Marxist, used to have frequently in the 30s, and the Armenia conferences that brought in people like Du Bois and others. And all of these were fairly progressive events. And Bunch joined Harris and others and considered themselves on the leftist Marxist side, whereas he would later, in the end of his life, come around to the more race-conscious side of politics. But in the meantime, and the thing that links them together is that are some peculiarities that, to be briefly summarized, from Mordecai Johnson, since Charles Harris reiterated it. Mordecai Johnson said, what is Bunch doing? Now this might be a quote. He's going around the world looking for a race problem. Doesn't he see one here? And it occurred to me in my moment of New World View that Bunch's tirades against other blacks, which came, not for not being radical enough, as in Detroit, came just before he went into the OSS, which was, of course, a precursor of his international involvement. In some sense, it's like he joined so many of the African-American scholarly community that would follow him in looking at a link on equity and inequality, first, sometimes internationally and sometimes nationally, and linking them together. In a sense, he seemed to get tired and to go abroad. First, he had exposure to a variety of people. I know Jomo Kenyatta is one. Then he looks to others, as many faculty do. And I want to say many faculty, I wanted to suggest that people like that Ron Walters and even Marguerite Barnett share in their coming to Howard this overlap of domestic and international politics in a way that seems to be intellectually intertwined. How many questions?
2 minutes.
Oh, good. All right. So I can begin my comments. Usually I think about a paper, and I can say it isn't published, but it's been published once. It's been republished on African-American presence in the United Nations, and it seems to me that there are themes in Bunch's experience here that you see in any African-American experience in the United Nations and maybe around the world. And there were some issues that links all of those major people who've been in that position. And it begins with a touch, it seems to me, of things that are influenced by the black experience and racial experiences. I think Charles, among others, talks about Bunches going to the Middle East and the assumptions that may have facilitated his rise to replace the UN ambassador that was supposed to be the negotiator, Bernadotte. I can never say his name right. It seems as if there were some Arab negotiators that thought an African American might be more trustworthy, or at least not a European. And that was one of the experiences that you see again, and I don't want to name the other instances, where race comes up significantly, first with Andrew Young that would follow him, and it comes up again with McDonald. But I will not try to go on that direction. Secondly, there's a point on Africa that goes beyond just the racial identification that has to do, I think, with the consciousness of the intellectual community. There are comments, and I can't find the place right now, Bunch trying to convince Lumumba not to trust the United Nations negotiators on a sort of mutual understanding that doesn't quite work out, but that you will find similar things with other African Americans that follow him. More importantly, there's an assumption that there should be such a relationship. There's a point, and Ralph Bunche's a speech at the Phi Beta Kappa Foundation here at Howard University. He talks about conflict resolution in a way he talks about it in the Nobel Prize speech that indicates a sense of that tie between understanding any injustice as a component, as someone suggested, and the stability and conflict and conflict resolution. I wanted to, I'll be 1 minute. I just wanted to indicate that a little bit, that this follows a lot of the faculty that come here either under its influence or subsequently. First, he reaches out in terms of inequality to the experiences of the French resistance by bringing Fall here, who would later die in an explosion in Vietnam and become a major scholar there. But he brought him here along with other people. Some people he didn't bring that follow, like that have to do with international instances of injustice that even when they are not brought here by, when they come later, as Marguerite Barnett had looked at Madras and inequality in India. And obviously we all know that Norman Walters, his concerns were intertwined nationally and internationally, so that the Howard School comes, whether intentionally or not, both through the link, in my view, with justice and racial justice, but also with the faculty that have chosen to come here and that tend to be invited here. And I unfortunately haven't had the time to talk about the historians and others with my limited knowledge, but I think that there is a school, even if I don't always see it.
I want to quickly call Professor Greg Carr, who's chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies. Thank you. Brief.
Oh, I got you. I'm looking at my watch. How's everybody doing? Thank you, Krista. And everyone who has spoken, thank you. I'm sitting there taking notes. And, unfortunately, I followed Professor Henry's advice many years ago when going to Black Studies. And I want to thank you publicly for that punishment. And to try to create a discipline in an age of post-disciplinarity is a very difficult thing to do. And it's all Black Studies in terms of subject matter, but how do you approach the study of the African experience is the question. To me, it seems that anytime you get a bunch of black folks together thinking about something, you are going to, by nature in this country, have a radical group that attracts other radicals. And I agree, Mordecai Johnson gets a lot of pride. I don't know how John Hope Franklin would feel since he couldn't get his phone to work or anything else. That going to happen. Some things don't really change. And that's one of the reasons when Brooklyn College said, hey man, we need a chair of history, he said, I'm out. But he did say, Thomas Sullivan talked about it too, Franklin said, I never thought I would leave Howard. I thought that was the pinnacle where I should be. And administration frustrated me, but that's where I thought I should be. And that's the reason why we still work it out. And that's why you don't see a whole lot of publications in the same volume, but that's why you have people who can actually live in what Mpate Ba in West Africa would call the living tradition. It's very important to think about that in that context. I agree with Professor Morris. The domestic and international dimensions are constantly intertwined. The American Negro has never been convinced that the American project should either succeed or continue. And I think that we have to be honest about that. And I think that that conversation often empties itself into very deep conflicts that can only be discussed in primarily black spaces like this one. The class diversity at Howard. In New York Times, I saw a couple of days ago, it talked about how these elite colleges aren't letting people in from certain social classes. Well, that's not a problem at Howard. You got Negroes here who can't pay their bills. You got other people who can just write the check. And in terms of economic diversity, this is probably the most, if not one of the most diverse universities in the world. And when you see that play out, it's played out from the very beginning. So yes, Mordecai Johnson did keep a lid on things, but he himself, talking about open socialism as a minister, upsetting some of the Howard Negroes who had many degrees and figured he shouldn't be here because he's a preacher. Ralph Bunch, E. Franklin Frazier, Doxy Wilkerson, very important. You know, I think I'm just going to quit the university altogether and go out and be a full-time revolutionary, as Gerald Horne described. These folks are together trying to figure out how do black people stay on this earth. And not just black people, but many others. And it's interesting, Professor Edgar, you mentioned that, I'm thinking about those two big tomes that Thomas Jesse Jones edited. Education in Africa and Education in Black America. And this idea that you have to somehow control these Negroes. But when you get too many of us together, this is what's going to happen. You know, we can label it, we can talk about it, but I'm going to conclude this by saying that for me, it began for me at Howard thinking about the Journal of Negro Education. I went looking for John Henry Clark because he published a couple of things in there, Way Keeping Among the God Peoples and things like that. And in reading the J&E, I'm seeing exactly what you're saying. It's all these superstars in my mind. These are the titans writing. And now, you know, Sterling Brown, I mean, you name it. And you think about the fact that they're walking around this campus. This used to be the law school, you know, before they built what is now the School of Architecture and Engineering. So this space right here, in this room, they're sitting there plotting the strategy for Brown. Yeah. Third floor and here. Third floor where our offices are in here. It's very interesting to think about that in the context of what happens after that. What if, and I'm fortunate enough to have a JD and just do a PhD. I wouldn't go into a courtroom for long because I figured it would all empty into your honor, please. As we'll probably find out in Ferguson, Missouri, just like we found out in Florida with Trayvon Martin. You're going to be on civil rights cases. You understand the standards. But they do let me teach a class at the law school on Monday and Wednesday night. And I was over there last night and I was asking them, I said, you know, we've read Jenna McNeil's book on Charlestown and Houston, but the question I would like to ask is, what if Houston had lived 10 more years? Given his relationship with the left and his work here at Howard, his interaction with people who we don't talk about a lot, and I swear we're going to have to teach Gerald Horne's book in the spring on William Patterson rather. Would he have gotten caught up and marginalized in the Red Scare? Because Negroes can never be trusted. We can't be trusted now in America. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be a black scholar in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, to be somebody like Merz Tate, who has this wide, disarmament, really? Disarmament in the 19th century? That's I can't wait to read that book. And you're right, you live over here. I think you're on the faculty. Every time I come down the basement, you down there in the papers. I'm going to have to steal you one day and you spare 30 minutes to come talk to these undergraduates, which is where I'm going to conclude. A year and a half ago, we pulled some undergrads together and I taught a class on the intellectual history of Howard. We used a couple of very good books. Jonathan Holloway's book on Howard. Also, my friend Zach Williams' book, Inserting Talented Tenth, which covers a lot of this ground. In addition, we read some primary documents because a lot of those conference papers that Dr. Johnson is going to help us by writing a book on, in addition to publishing a number of articles, are up in these stats. When those students are reading that work and trying to puzzle through that, what they find is people who were thinking like them, except it was 2 generations ago. And then they walk across a living bridge that was built by people like Ron Walters and Joyce Ladner. And then when we read E. Franklin Frazier's piece, Dr. Henry, in that book, The Death of White Sociology, called The Failure of the Negro Intellectual, what does Franklin Frazier say? Published posthumously. He says, you know, I'm at these conferences and people all over the world are talking about life and the meaning of life and struggle. He said, and the American Negro is talking about race. This is a man who may have been toward, you know, a little disillusioned near the end of his life, perhaps, as you're reading, but what struck me as I take my seat is the idea that you spend your whole life struggling in these spaces. And you're not struggling in these spaces just because of intellectual curiosity. You're struggling in these spaces because you want to make a difference in the world and intervene on behalf of people who haven't had people to understand these things and then come out and say, maybe we should move this way. And you take a step back at the end of your life, whether it be Franklin Frazier, whether it be William Leo Hansberry, whether it be Merz Tate, whether it be Lorraine Williams, and you go on and on and on, and maybe you say to yourself, I wonder if I ran my lap to the best of my ability. But moments like this convinced me that not only did they do that well, but they have left for us the blueprint for us to take our lap a little bit more seriously than we have, and perhaps step up in face of people like Barack Obama and some of these neoliberal icons across the range and say, let us stand for what they stood for, and perhaps we can earn the title of scholars. Or maybe not. Thank you.
Dr. Howard Dodson, who's the director of libraries here, and the Moreland Supreme Court Research Center, to give some closing remarks and lead us. We're running late. I am going to give people an opportunity to make some comments and questions from the audience, and the food is there waiting for us in just a few minutes. So, Dr. Dodson.
Well, first of all, on behalf of the Moreland Spring Yard and Howard University, I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. Second, I want to thank Professor Johnson for pulling this particular program together. And I want to thank her for 2 or 3 reasons. The first one is that I've been here now about, I'm going on 2 years, about I guess 18 months or so. And my assignment, quite frankly, was to try to reorganize Moreland and reorganize the libraries. And in approaching Moreland as a place, one of the things that struck me more significantly than anything else was the richness of the materials that are there. Of work done at Howard that for the most part is not accessible broadly. Yes, a lot of it was published in the Journal of Negro Education, and that is accessible at one level. A lot was published in the Journal of Negro History, and a lot of that is accessible at one level, but it's not accessible under Howard's brand. What do I mean by that? Howard, it appears among all the rest of this stuff, and you have to dig in whatever the footnote is or whatever the biography of the individual is to find out there's any association with Howard at all. And because of that, you're not able to begin to put together this material as an intellectual foundation for talking about the Howard School in this, that, or the other field or discipline. Now, as in my own work as a historian, I came to know very, very early on that there was something special going on at Howard. And that certainly in the early part of from about the 20s on, most of the fields that I have had some kind of intellectual interest in, growing up in the field of Black Studies as well, had their foundational intellectual roots here at Howard. If it has something to do with people of African descent in the United States, to some extent in the Caribbean, and to some extent on the African continent, if you trace it back to certainly the American Academy, and frequently outside of the Academy, the roots of it is somehow or another connected with Howard and what's going on at this place. That is not reflected in the literature that it basically structures the fields right now. It's not reflected there because 3 or 4 reasons. The first has been mentioned already, which is the major disciplines did not respect nor honor the work. And I can say this, Charles, you'll probably, I was in Berkeley. I did my doctoral work at Berkeley. And I'm in the doctoral program with students who are getting ready to graduate in a program called the History of Black People and Race Relations. And they didn't know there was such a thing called the Journal of Negro History. At the University of California at Berkeley, where they had a very, very strong program and faculty dealing with African American studies. Something's wrong with that picture. Second, so they weren't being found in the disciplines. A lot of the work that was done here, specifically the social science department's work, etc., is published locally and is never distributed beyond Howard. Okay? And that extends into areas like African American literature, African American art history. You can go through the fields that ultimately become the foundations of African American studies, and virtually every one of them you'll find that there's foundational work done here at Howard by faculty at Howard. So I have as one of my major projects in the library at Moreland to begin to digitize all that work. We've already started, and we're negotiating a deal with, I'm forgetting the name right now, but the Journal of Labor Education is actually distributed digitally through a commercial, it's actually a nonprofit firm, the JSTOR. It's now being distributed by JSTOR. Well, JSTOR, basically, we're going to be able to claim it, put it back in the Howard University IR, not international relations, but institutional repository. And make that information, recognized as something emanating from Howard when it comes out. And we'll be able to do that with a lot of we have a very extensive file of basically the tear sheets, the faculty, of papers published by faculty. We're going to publish all of those, but obviously copyright permitting. And we have as plans to actually enter into a partnership to do all of the dissertations and theses. That's all foundational work done here at Howard that's not a part of the current discourse, but when put into this repository will end up in every Google search and will allow people to find that work and reposition Howard and Howard's work as the foundation of African American studies in this country. Now, about 2 or 3 weeks after arriving here, I ended up in a conversation with some of the faculty and gave a bunch of grief. And at the foundation of the grief was this: how did you all let Skip Gates declare that Harvard was the center of black study? How did you all let him happen to do that? Now, Harvard may have 20 or 25 people who specialize in African diaspora studies, maybe 20 or 25 affiliated with the program here. Howard has over 250 people here on faculty that cover virtually any aspect and any dimension, any discipline having something to do with black folk. And they have a bunch of work that's already been done, but like the work that's in here, it's scattered all over the place, not under Howard brand. We're going to be working with faculty to start getting their work into this kind of Howard branded repository so that people will begin to see the extraordinary level and quality of work that's been produced by this institution, and that frankly has laid the foundations for the intellectual foundations for work, not just in the field of African diaspora studies, as already suggested here, but in a broad spectrum of areas that in the United States at least has not been recognized. And until the voices of these folk who produce this work is part of the discourse, it's a dishonest discourse. And so I'll stop there and I trust you.
We had we were trying to cover a lot of ground in a short period of time. And we've come to our end. We have food for everyone in the back. But I do want to implore people to stay in your seats for just a few more minutes, because I'd like to, I know you all came and this is a wonderful turnout, and I'm sure we want to hear your comments and reflections for a few minutes. So the floor is open. And also to just let people know, as I started off, this is hopefully the beginning of this dialogue and this project. You're going to hear more from us. Hopefully we can have a day-long conference next time, so we'll have much more time and opportunity to discuss, obviously, a topic which is in an area which is near and dear to some of our hearts, and certainly of intellectual interest to a broad spectrum of people. So, comments and questions from the audience? Yes.
Just quickly, I've been watching a lot of my name is Austin Thompson. A lot of the coverage of Ferguson from the rest of the world has been highly racialized there. And the discussions of the Ayatollah in Iran, or I was reading the major newspaper in China and their discussions about race relations in the United States. And it makes me wonder, with the context internationally being a lot different than what it was at the time period we've been discussing, what would the Howard School of Scholarship, or that vein of scholarship, look like in a multipolar world with the emergence of China and the Asian countries that are now contesting for power, and how would they view those changes in relationship to the racial relations in the United States?
Do a dissertation. That's what we need. Yeah, interesting. In the back.
Good evening. My name is Kevin Peters. I am a second-year PhD student in the school of graduate school of sociology. My question kind of goes into this being the Black Center of Intellectual Course, and I was wondering, is there like a strategic plan to engage and to interact more with graduate students here who would like to move forward this agenda? And is there a strategic plan to have measurable outcomes in the sense that I know other universities have, like, graduate students are on committees and assist with this type of movements?
Of course, I can't speak to
The
that.
answer is yes. We can talk after the answer is definitely yes.
We're working on that?
Yeah. No, because in the presidential, the PCAR work that we did, that President Frederick continued to shape, a couple of things. At the undergraduate level, there is an international studies major that's coming before the board in September. Faculty, there's a lot of faculty in here who worked on that the last 10 years. The graduate school level, there's been a lot of talk, in addition to the centers that have been established, the Ron Walters Center. We've heard a lot about Ron Walters. That's operational. Center for the Study of the African Diaspora, Krista knows, we've had those conversations over the years. Dr. Frederick has committed to continuing that work. And in terms of graduate studies, one of the ideas is that graduate students would be linked to that center as fellows. So that this will continue. And then finally, and Professor Dodson can, back me on this, Howard University still has a press and still publishes.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, it's funny to be talked about as if it doesn't exist anymore. You understand? But oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the signature pieces it did, and Brother Dodson, you can back. The New York African Burial Ground stuff came out as a collaboration between the GSA and the Howard University Press, all 8 volumes of it. So I mean, there's plenty of work. But we've talked a lot about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Gwen Michael, Georgetown University. I'm just thoroughly delighted to be here and to hear this conversation. I knew that there was a Howard School, I just did not know how all of these people were connected together. But my question has to do with the press issue. When you said there was a press, I said, really? Because Howard University Press books are no longer really accessible for people, and it's really hard for it. But I wondered how much of what you're talking about, you need to revive the press.
Yes.
But how much is going to be republished through the press? Because it strikes me that that's a major way for you to get that out there, digitally as well as in print.
Much of the work that was previously published by the press has in fact been digitized at one time or another. We're actually trying to reassemble it and put it online as digital publications with the option of being able to do off-prints in hard copy after that. There are a number of policy and other issues that have not been worked through yet. But the press just published a book less than a month ago. And it premiered in Hawaii at a medical conference. And it's still publishing quietly. Where is it located? That's it. This is a purposeful world.
It doesn't exist anywhere physically?
It does not have formal physical offices, though it has associations that allow it to do work. And I'll leave it at
Other questions?
Jeannie Tungara, History Department. I'm so happy to hear this story about, this work on Murph's tape. When you finish, would you please come back? Because the History Department, should host you. She was such a part of our department, as you've laid out so very well. So it would be appropriate for us to have a wonderful book signing here, in her honor and yours.
It might be a while.
Historians are used to waiting.
You're at the top of the list.
Perfect. And the other thing that we did here at Howard was to have a few years ago a conference about John Hope Franklin, the Howard years, because we knew that, well, he'd made such an important contribution to our department, but that his years here at Howard were so formative. And part of what we did was a brochure that had some of the photos that you even see passing on the screen. And I would like to give you one of those brochures. I still have some. And we included some of his writings and speeches and such as a part of that, because he made commencement speeches here and such. So for my colleagues, I would say that this program is almost a continuation of many programs that have come before, and we need to document these efforts as well. I know our John Hope Franklin conference was recorded, and we're working on a volume of conference papers, from that. So, and these kinds of ways, can feed in with what Dr. Dodson is talking about in terms of documenting those intellectuals, that have really been such icons nationally and internationally. And John Hope Franklin was certainly one of those as well.
Yes, all the way to the back.
So that we don't wait for another century. So how this kind of setting? Are there any plans to engage in our one century to continue with that?
We're going to continue the dialogue, and certainly we're going to include as many groups on campus and as many, outfits on campus. I see Dr. Elsie Scott is here. Her center, absolutely. The Ralph Budd Center. I thought I saw Dr. Wutos earlier. Maybe he might have left. I think he's kind of filling in as the director there. But yes, absolutely. I think the Ralph Budd Center is going through a bit of a transition at the moment, so their role is a little bit up in the air, but absolutely. We're going to continue this dialogue in probably multiple forms, but certainly we're going to include as many groups on campus as possible.
And I'll just add that the library will be doing a series of forums over the next 2 years, looking at other segments of Howard's intellectual tradition and trying to both familiarize Howard University and its faculty and students with that work, and create a better documentation of what has come in the past so that we can continue to build this knowledge base. Look forward to having many of you here for some of the future sessions.
Yes.
Yeah, I had two thoughts. One is, I say that this is being recorded. I was thinking, does the university have a PR person who would get stories in the press about this that would be sort of juxtaposed with the stories in the press about how Howard is going off the map, or maybe going off the map? That it seems to me that it would be really good for you to try to get these things in sort of broader circulation audience. And of course your school newspaper, in the old days, the Hilltop would have had summaries of everybody's talk. As I found out reading this. My other thing is this sort of an offhanded question. When the book about the Howard School comes out, will it be published by Howard University Press?
Well, hope.
And if it is, will it be available?
Yeah. Should be made available. Any other comments? Please, we have food in the back. Let's continue the discussion.